Okay, thanks for the introduction, Pete. So this work is joint with Alejandro Zettner, who's an economist at UT Dallas. And I'll just mention in terms of some people in the room who know me, maybe wondering why is Gord studying this. Alejandro has a nonprofit in Texas, which is very focused on educating people about how to protest your property valuation to lower your property taxes, very focused on immigrants and lower income folks, just making them aware that these processes exist. And through conversations with him, we kind of struck upon some points of mutual interest here. What we're looking at in this context are hearings over people's property appraisal protests. If you appeal the valuation you got in the mail from the county, they may make you a small reduction offer. And if you don't accept that, in Texas at least, you go to a hearing. And the hearings that people are attending in this case are in front of a panel of judges, ARB members, appraisal review board members. And those people are basically a panel of peers. So to be an ARB member, you just have to live in the same county for a couple of years, and you make a small amount of money for serving on that panel. And the point is, it's not a very formal role, it's not a very well compensated role, and there's huge opportunity for biases to creep into the judgments that are happening here. So this is part of why we're looking at this, and we're trying to quantify this, okay? So a lot of people don't realize that you have this option to protest your property valuation. I didn't actually know that until this project started. So everybody kind of, you own a house, you will get something in the mail at some point in the year saying, this is what we have determined your home is worth. It's going to now dictate your property tax for the year. You can push back on this in basically every county in the United States, and actually a lot of countries outside of the United States, and there's a process in place to handle that. We're focused on Texas, where every county functions the same way, as I described a moment ago. Why is this interesting? Well, I think I don't necessarily need to sell this to you that this is an important topic. Property tax revenue is one of the biggest sources of revenue for government in the world, and certainly in the United States. And there's, as I mentioned, a lot of opportunity for bias to creep into this process and to make taxation unfair, which is kind of fundamentally undemocratic, and that's kind of a problem. Reinforce inequalities in home ownership and all these types of things, okay? We want to understand the extent to which it exists in this context, try to quantify it, and then try to understand why it's happening once we show you that it's there. I'm going to do that with Gen AI. Okay. I just described this for you, so I'm going to skip this. I have some excess slides here. I'm sorry. But we're going to be focused on Harris County, Texas, which is basically Houston. It is the third largest county in the United States. It's actually politically moderate. So if we're thinking about biases around demographics and other things, it's kind of an ideal context to study this because we have a good mix of people involved, politically and also demographically. Our data include structured hearing records and the outcome for each hearing that happened over the course of 10 years. So from 2013 to 2023, we have the conduct and result of every hearing that took place, where somebody protested their taxes and went to a formal hearing for this. In addition, we have audio recordings of every single hearing that took place. I found out by accident that these existed because it's not publicly documented anywhere. And once I found out that they existed, I issued a Freedom of Information Act request to the county, and they said, okay, and they sent them to me. So I've got, about 10,000 of these for 2022, and literally my laptop upstairs is processing the other 90,000. So this is also going to be surprisingly cheap. My argument here is you couldn't do this with human coders because we're talking about literally 3 years of audio recordings cumulatively. And so people are going to sit through that and tell you what's on them. But Jim and I can do that in a few hours, right? Okay. So I'm partway through the audio recording data. You're going to get work in process results. Okay, bear that in mind. So I mentioned ARB members. There's some criteria to be an ARB member, but the main one is that you have resided in the county for 2 years and you lack conflicts of interest. Okay, you have to recuse yourself from any case where you may know the other party, and in general, you can't own, for example, like a real estate investment company or something like this. Okay, beyond that, you basically interview with a local district judge, and then they decide to hire you. And in general, there are typically several hundred active ARB members in the county, and whenever a hearing is called for, they draw at random from the pool. So we have a natural randomized experiment. Okay, kind of like judges are often randomly assigned to cases. We can use a similar approach from the judge literature, judge IV literature, to study what's going on with bias among ARB members. That's what we're going to do here. How do I know they're randomly assigned? Because Texas law says they have to be. So it's in like the tax code that by definition, these people have to be randomly assigned to cases. So We're going to focus on gender here. I will be honest that we initially began with race, but the problem is figuring out the races of the people at the hearing is very challenging because all we have are names and audio. And as a result, there's tons of measurement error. Like with names, it's very challenging to properly identify somebody's race, okay? Large volumes of mistakes will happen. With gender, that's still true, but to a much lesser degree, focusing on first names. There are unisex names, of course, but by and large, we can make a pretty good determination, a confident one, based on matching the Social Security Administration records. If we focus on names, where say 98% of people with this name are, for instance, male in the SSA, we can be very confident about those imputations. So we focus on gender for that reason to begin. We do have plans to look at other sources of possible gender bias by looking at, for instance, the value of your home in the county property records relative to the person that showed up. If they have a more valuable home than you, does that affect your judgments? Things like that. So we're still working on this. So we use Social Security Administration data and impute people's gender based on their first names. We do this for all of the panelists. Typically, there will be 3 panelists. There may be 1. I can discuss that more if people want to know. We also do a gender imputation for the person that shows up as the representative of the property. So generally it will be the owner, but not always. And then also the appraiser from the county who came up with the initial evaluation. They're in the room too, and we account for their gender as well. I'll tell you, by and large, it's not going to matter to the outcomes. Some descriptive statistics. I don't want to spend too much time because we're short on time, but about 35% of the people that show up to protest tax appraisal values are women. 2/3 are men. The chair of the panel is the primary speaker. So among the 3 members, right, about 55% of the time it is a woman. Basically, you get very balanced gender representation on the ARB, actually, which makes me, I suspect that they are focused on having gender representation balance here when they're forming the panel in terms of who's in the pool, I mean. Okay, about 20% of these end up happening online. So these days, if you ask, if you request it, they have to let you do the hearing online via WebEx or Zoom. That started during COVID. Just something that's worth noting. And yeah, our main outcome of interest is going to be a binary indicator of whether the ARB gave you a reduction in your home value or not as a result of the hearing. I also have a continuous measure of how many dollars savings you got as well that we look at for robustness. Okay. Let's get through this. So very basic regression. If this is a true randomized experiment, then if I just run a simple regression, I don't have any controls or anything in here for what else is going on with your property or the case, et cetera, then I should see a relationship if there's some kind of bias going on, dependent on gender. And what we're really looking at here is gender concordance or discordance effects. Okay, so the left-hand column, this is the effect for females who show up to protest their property taxes. The right-hand column is if I'm a male and I show up to protest my property taxes. The effect of having the chair be female versus male. For women, if the chair of the panel is a woman, there's a 1.4 percentage point reduction in your probability that you save anything on your taxes. For men, there is no effect at all. Okay? It's a precise 0. Now, I can complicate things. Let's assume maybe, even though by law they're supposed to be randomly assigning people, maybe they're not, okay? Because that's always a possibility. So we're going to try to be a bit more robust with the way we do this analysis. So I can look at either of my hearing outcomes. So do you save anything or not? How much do you save? As a function of, okay, we can still focus on panel chair, gender, but I'll also do a model where I'm going to look at how many women are on the panel, okay? We can try to account for things like have you been protesting recently, like last year, and what happened? Are you online or not? And how much is their home actually worth? What year are we in? Because there's things that shift over time in terms of caps on how much of a reduction is allowed, right? Or how much we're allowed to raise property taxes from one year to the next. We're going to account for all this stuff and see if it matters. And basically it matters, but we still come to the same conclusion. Okay, so this is for female analysts who are protesting their taxes. We estimate a 1.2 percentage point reduction when they have a female chair in front of them in the panel. For men, precise 0, essentially, a null result, even accounting for all this other stuff. If I look at these 3-member panels, because by the way, I can have a 1-member panel or a 3-member panel, even though 90% of the time it's 3-member. When I just focus on the 3-member panels, for each additional woman that gets added to the panel, it gets worse for female applicants. For men, nothing's happening. Okay, so it's very evident that there is a gender discordance or concordance effect going on. It's not clear that women are going harder on women or whether men are going easier on women, but one of those two things or both are happening. So now we're going to try and understand in my last 2 minutes why. Okay, I'm just going to skip through here. So I'm taking audio files and trying to code things that are happening in the hearing from the audio at scale. This is something the government doesn't do. So the county basically has all these things sitting on tape drives and never looks at them again. The reason they're recording them is for liability reasons. In case something happens in the hearing, they need to be able to go pull it up and hear what happened. So I'm going to go through all the recordings at scale using Gemini 1.5 Flash. Why Flash? Because it's dirt cheap, essentially. So for like $500, I could get through 10,000 recordings and ask all these questions. And I could do it quickly. And so I asked you several questions about what's happening in the hearings. Some of it is about tone of the person that's protesting, like do they sound frustrated? Are they confident? Do they sound nervous? Some of it is about objective behaviors. Did they reference any evidence? Did they raise their voice and yell at someone? Were they interrupting people? My point here is to try to understand when you have gender concordance or discordance, are you seeing shifts in the behavior of the appellant that might explain why they're losing more often? To the extent that's not true, then we might start wondering, okay, maybe this has nothing to do with their behavior and it's just some inherent sort of implicit bias that's going on with implications for how we think about dealing with this, right? What do I find? Well, there are some differences across the genders of the appellants, but generally not in ways that are tied to the gender of the person that's hearing my case. The only couple of exceptions we see, so this is how long the hearings are lasting, by the way. This is from the metadata of the audio file. Women tend to get shorter hearings in front of other women. It's about a minute or 45 seconds shorter on average. The typical hearing is 15 minutes long. So this is substantial. So that says something is happening more quickly. I don't know what exactly, but in terms of like sounding assertive, Gemini doesn't really think there's any differences going on. Being frustrated, no differences. Men tend to sound more confident than women, but not in a way that depends on panelist gender. Women tend to sound more nervous than men, but not in a way that depends on panelist gender. By this way, this could be the bias. By the way, this could be bias in the LLMs itself. I'll just warn you that when it hears a certain gender speaking, it may make an inference that's not necessarily true. So we need to be aware of that. Sounding defensive, again, it's not differing in ways that depend on the panelist gender. Men are more likely to yell. Men are more likely to interrupt, especially a female panelist. So that's actually happening here, but it wouldn't explain why men are doing better in front of a woman necessarily. But by and large, we don't see results here that seem like they can explain the effect we're seeing in the average outcomes. So what I'm going to do next, well, I'll try. I know this is a bad control. You know, if you're into econometrics, this is probably a bad move to try to control for things that are affected by the treatment as part of your regression. But I'll try to account for these behaviors just by throwing them into the regression and see what happens to my estimate of the effect on the outcome when I do that. Controlling for all this stuff, characterizing the appellant's behavior, we still see, this is a now saved. Any save this here. The effect actually gets a little bigger. So now it's a 3 percentage point drop, conditional on having a woman in front of you instead of a man. Controlling for all the behavior and hearing. Suggesting that whatever women are doing differently in front of another woman is actually helping their case. It's masking the bias, and actually is worse than we thought, maybe. Now, the last thing I'll say, because I think I'm kind of out of time, we're doing some evaluation to see, is Gemini really saying what a human would say is happening, or is it just making stuff up, right? By and large, I would characterize Gemini with audio coding, annotating, at about on par with like a moderately attentive human. Like, it does pretty well in cases where humans are doing well. So we got 100 audio files drawn at random, and we asked several hundred people on Prolific to answer the same questions about those audio files and compared it with Gemini. And basically what we're seeing, well, they come very, so this is like a rating of intercoder reliability. Just comparing Gemini with human coders is this column. Over here is humans compared with themselves. Like how consistent are the humans even? In cases where the humans are very in agreement with one another, Gemini is typically agreeing too. Okay, so like about the gender of the person on the recording, or whether they're referencing evidence. There are some things though where Gemini starts to be a little bit less in agreement. So here the humans are agreeing about the person being the owner versus not, asking the panelists to speak louder, interrupting people, yelling. Still doing pretty good. It's like FAIR agreement, right? This is Cohen's kappa and Krippendorf's alpha measures of intercoded reliability. Gemini's doing pretty well, actually. When you get the tonal stuff, like sounding nervous, sounding frustrated, whatever, Gemini's terrible at that. Okay, I wouldn't trust an LLM to judge sentiment of sound from a human. Okay, it's kind of an interesting result on the side, by the way. So, because I may not trust all these measures necessarily, the other thing we do is we get transcriptions from OpenAI Whisper of the audio recording, so all the text transcribed from the audio, and then we get that into an embedding model, and we get 700 and whatever dimensional embeddings that are basically a data compression, right? Compressed representation of everything that happens in the hearing without, in a data-driven way, without us manually coding it. And we try to condition on that as a bunch of covariates using double machine learning, and we still get the same answer. Conditioning on whatever's happening, 2.2 percentage point drop in your probability of savings if you're a woman in front of a woman. I'm going to stop there because Pete's about to cut me off. This is my summary slide. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Absolutely amazing. On so many levels. Lots of questions.
Super interesting. Can you use the information on how men rates for men to see if it's that men are just like being extra generous with women because they feel bad for them, and then it's just women are not having some innate anti-woman bias? Because that would be it would be really interesting to know if actually like women are all sexist to each other, or if it's just that men are being very generous to women. And you know how they rate the men.
And you're talking about using the prolific data.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I haven't thought about that at all. I literally just did the prolific stuff 2 days ago, so I haven't thought very deeply about it yet, but that's a really good suggestion.
Hi, I was wondering, I don't know if you had access to this, but did you at all consider age and the age differences between the applicant versus the panelists, between the women? Because I have a hypothesis about generational differences between women, but I would wonder if you have that data available.
So unfortunately, there is no age data recorded in here. It's not to say that I couldn't get it through asking for more records. But what I can tell you is the average age of ARB members tends to be relatively high because a lot of the hearings are happening like on a weekday in the middle of the day. It tends to be retirees, I would say. So the average age is somewhat high and the pay is not that great. So it's people that don't have other stuff to do during the day. Yeah, so that generational thing may play a role.
Go over here.
Yeah, Eddie.
Hey, thank you. The presentation was fantastic. Really, really interesting. Do you have any way to assess bias on the applicant side? In other words, if it's the case that female applicants are more likely to provide true information, then the reduction downward is not that they're being penalized, they're just getting closer to a true value, where maybe the male side is more likely to use bias because there's judgment in what these discussions are involving, something like that. I don't know if there's a way to do that.
So are you suggesting that when a woman has a female panel in front of them, they're more likely to get real information?
That they're somehow eliciting getting closer to what the true value of the underlying property is, right? It's about property taxes. Whereas in the male case, maybe there's a greater deviation, or they're just able to maintain and stay away from what that true value is. Got it.
So at the moment, so part of the problem here is that valuation in general is subjective, right? So I don't know if it's an answerable question. It's a good point. There are other, like, I have gotten Gemini to code what types of evidence are being referenced. One result I did not show here is I have models I run that are split by gender concordant, discordant pair. So like women, 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 men, men, women, men, men. And in each of those, if I look at presentation of evidence, the effect of that on your likelihood of saving something is about a 10 percentage point increase in your probability of saving something in every gender pair except women and women, where it gets discounted to about 7%. So basically, evidence being shown is receiving less consideration in the female-female pair, which makes me a little bit think it's women going harder on women, but that's the closest evidence I have.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. So sorry for all the delayed questions. I know there's more. Please email.
Sure, yeah, please email me if you have questions.